In this land, autumn didn't end all at once. It wore itself down like fabric, day by day, through rain and wind, until nothing remained but wet soil, black as if it had grieved something to death. Marlene Lowry had lived on this patch of earth ever since two things died in her: the will to leave, and the belief that anyone was coming to help. The house stood near the edge of the forest, lopsided, with one warm room, two small windows, a creaking roof, and a view of the dead field where cattle used to graze. Now there was only silence, pierced by the call of crows. She woke up early, not out of duty, but because anything else was impossible. Her body woke on its own, the way it had learned to for 6 years now. Since Eli's death, since the day she was left with a child, a half-healed burn on her shoulder, and half an ash-blackened barn. That's when time split into before and after. The morning smelled of ash. The stove was cold again. She had to start it up. She pulled on a thick shawl, grabbed kindling, touched the tinder damp. She'd have to wait. There was enough firewood. She'd learned to split logs without help. She'd learned everything without help. On the table lay a calendar, October. Eli's birthday was in November. They used to bake apple cakes and eat them straight from the tray, too warm to hold. There were no apples now. The orchard had died. But the habit remained. Every October, Marlene baked one small cake. For her son, and a little bit for memory. The boy was 9. His name was Seth. He slept in the corner, wrapped in a coarse blanket, turned toward the wall. He had Eli's eyes. Sometimes, Marlene looked at him too long, not because she admired him, but because she tried to remember what his father looked like that last day, the final one. No traces since then, not one. No one found the men who came, and the one man who was supposed to show up never did. Not that night, not after. No letter, no word, just a name. She no longer allowed herself to speak. But lately, the wind had changed. It came from the north, and it carried more than cold. It smelled of roads. There was something in it, a trace of iron, the salt of sweat, the smoke of old campfires. And every time it rattled the shutters, Marlene's heart jumped for a fraction of a second before settling back into her chest. She stepped out onto the porch. The ground squelched beneath her boots. The sky hung low, as if it had bent down to listen. On the hill, near the edge of the woods, stood a raven. Alone, it did not fly away. And in that moment she understood something was coming. Not trouble, not a storm, a name she thought she'd long since forgotten. The morning air was thick and taut, like a wet rope stretched too tight. The ground had softened from the rain, and each step left a mark, as if the earth itself remembered who was still alive. On the northern side, near the old marsh, a fire had appeared. Seth had spotted it while coming back with kindling. He mentioned it in passing, never stopping what he was doing, but his eyes drifted toward his mother, as if to see whether she'd caught it. Marlene heard. She didn't ask, didn't react. But later that evening, once Seth was asleep, she stepped out onto the porch and looked toward the trees. Beyond the brush, where wild land began, a thin column of smoke curled upward. Like a memory, like a warning. The path to the marsh knew her step. She had walked it many times, not for answers, but to remember what being forgotten looked like. Yet tonight, it felt different. At every turn, a snapped twig, a print in the mud, the sharp scent of smoke. The fire pit still held a faint glow, but no one remained. Only a tipped kettle, a scorched strip of bandage, and a fresh trail of blood curved like a crescent on a stone. The cloth was military. A scrap of uniform. That green-grey tone, she recognized it instantly. Once it had been familiar, like the smell of tobacco in the house, like Eli's voice behind her shoulder. Now it felt foreign, like the man who had worn it. He was hurt, moving slowly, still nearby. She hadn't brought a weapon. There was no need. If he meant harm, he wouldn't have lit a fire, wouldn't have left tracks. He knew she would come. On her way back, she glanced up. Hanging from a dry hazel branch was an old belt buckle. Simple, cracked at the side. Once it held a holster, the one Daniel had fixed for Eli. Back in the year, everything began to fall apart. He had left it here, deliberately. He remembered, or wanted her to. That night, she didn't sleep. The wind rose and fell, like the breath of someone fevered. The house stayed quiet, but inside her, a hum that wouldn't stop. In the morning, before the stove had warmed, she opened the door and found a bundle of cloth on the porch. Inside a rifle. Eli had taken it from Daniel the day before he was killed. Said the scope was off. It had never come back. Marlene sat with the rifle across her lap, holding it like a child. No fear, no anger, just the weight in her hands. He had come back. Not to the house, not yet, but close. Close enough to be seen. She didn't need to ask why. The answer lived in every nail she had driven in herself, in every unpaid bill she stretched until the end. He knew, and still, he came. Too late to fix what had broken, but maybe not too late to face what remained. That night, the wind swept the last of the leaves from the fields. The sky hung low, like a heavy blanket, and in its folds, one could hear something resembling a moan. Marlene sat at the table, sharpening a knife old, kitchen-worn, its handle slightly bent. Not for defense, just so her hands had something to do. The fire by the ravine had long since gone out, but she knew he was still nearby. He couldn't have gone far. If he had, he wouldn't have left the rifle, wouldn't have left a sign, which meant he was waiting, or couldn't get up. At dawn, she threw on her coat, took the flask, tightened the laces of her boots, and stepped outside. Seth was still asleep. She didn't leave a note. He would understand. The boy had learned to read silence. The path to the ravine felt longer. Frost had settled over the trail. In a dip between two roots, she noticed a footprint wide, heavy, with a distinctive worn-down edge at the heel. An old military boot. Not something you'd find in a village store, and not something you could mistake. Farther ahead, a smear of blood, small but fresh. Then a scrap of bandage, and then him. He lay under the roots, like in a child's game, where you hide from the world, curled in on himself, covered by a coat. His cheek was in the mud, lips blue. Fever had already begun its work. He didn't wake when she leaned over him, just mumbled something incoherent, maybe a name, maybe a prayer. Marlene didn't hesitate. She grabbed him by the shoulders, tightened the bandage, checked his pulse, then slung his arm over her back, slowly, without jerking. The body weighed nothing, except for the guilt it carried. She dragged him home like a burden others had left behind. Every 20 steps, she stopped to breathe, then walked on. His breathing was shallow, uneven. He smelled of smoke and sweat, but he was alive. When they reached the house, she didn't call for Seth. She took Daniel straight into the barn. It was warm in there. Once the goats had wintered in that space. Now, it was empty. She laid him on a pile of straw, brought in water, lit the lamp, took off his coat, then the shirt. Beneath it, dried blood and a wound along his side. Not fatal, but deep. It needed cleaning, quickly. She didn't ask any questions, didn't wait for him to speak. The only thing that mattered now was making sure he didn't die under her roof. For the first time in 6 years, a man lay inside the Lowry home. Not because he asked, not because he was welcome, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. He lay in the barn for nearly a full day. Seth never asked who he was. Just once, he peeked in, saw the man under the blanket, and walked out without a word. Marlene gave him small tasks: count the flour sacks, sweep the porch, and he completed them all like a grown man. Quietly, without complaint. Daniel slept fitfully. His body would jerk, his breathing would falter, his forehead stayed burning hot. The fever held on. She changed his bandages, gave him broth, checked the wound. The bullet had only grazed him, but the filth in the wound was doing its own damage. Sometimes he'd wake for a few seconds, rasp something out, eyes unfocused, not recognizing her, and then sink back into the fever. Marlene did everything in silence. Not like a nurse tending the wounded, but like a farmer repairing a roof with fatigue, with a clear purpose, and without unnecessary feeling. But inside, she was boiling. He was here, on her straw, in the shadow of her home. After 6 years, after everything, and she didn't know why. Outside, the wind twisted the clothesline rope. Dogs from the neighboring plot howled for the second night in a row. The owls had gone quiet. The world seemed to be holding its breath, not to disturb them. A woman and a man, walled in by their own unfinished story. Late at night, he opened his eyes and stared into the dark. She stood against the wall, a lamp in her hand. He didn't speak. Neither did she. She simply placed the lamp closer and sat down beside him. He didn't look away. In his eyes, there was no fear, only emptiness and regret. An hour later, he drifted back to sleep. Marlene stayed awake. She sat, chin resting on her palm, watching his face. It had changed. His cheeks were sunken, his hair darker now, no grey, but the look in his eyes was different. The look of someone who no longer searched for a path, who simply walked until the trail ran out. She remembered the day he was supposed to come, but he hadn't. That day, she served Eli dinner, chicken broth and bread. Seth was playing with a knife on the porch. Daniel had promised to stop by. "I'll swing through after lunch." Then came the fire, the screams, gunshots. No Daniel, no horse, not even a trace. Only ash and a night in which she was alone for the first time. And now he lay in front of her, breathing hoarsely, hot as a blacksmith's iron. And she held a rag in her hand and couldn't let go, not because she was afraid, but because she had held it all in for too long. Before dawn, he opened his eyes again. This time, he recognized her, spoke quietly, more to himself than to her. "You shouldn't have saved me." She didn't respond, only soaked the cloth and touched it to his forehead. Bitterness rose in her throat. He still believed he had the right to say what she should or shouldn't have done, even though 6 years ago he had made all the decisions in silence. Now he was here. Too late to ask for anything, but maybe not too late to endure it all. He came to on the 3rd day. The fever had broken, but his body still seemed sunken in a bog. Daniel barely ate, but he could now prop himself up on his elbows, could speak. The first thing he said, upon seeing Seth in the doorway, "He's your son." Marlene nodded, without a smile, without pride, just confirming what already was. Seth stood silently with a bowl in his hands, then placed the food on a crate and walked out. In that gesture was everything: wariness, curiosity, and a shadow, the kind children inherit from grown-ups, like a scar passed down without words. That evening, Marlene stepped into the barn and sat on the bench across from him. The lamp gave off a dim light. The smell of iodine and old wood mixed with silence, like in an abandoned barracks. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back, Neither of them turned away. And at some point, she started speaking. Not with reproach, but with the kind of weariness that sounded louder than anger in her voice. She told him how, that night, she had held Seth under one arm and led him through the dark field while their roof burned behind them. How she had waited for him for Daniel because he had promised. How she buried her husband with her own hands. How she was too ashamed to ask for help. How every day she got up, not because there was anything to live for, but because otherwise the house would fall apart. She told it all, steady, clear. No dramatics, but every word weighed something. And each time she went silent, the silence wasn't a pause, it was a sentence. He listened, never interrupted, just pressed his lips together when she mentioned hauling water alone, holding their son when he could barely breathe from coughing, pounding her fist against the empty table when the flour finally ran out. Then he said, "I wasn't hiding behind cowards. I wasn't holed up in the hills. I did what I could, where I could." His voice was hoarse, but there was no justification in it. He told her he couldn't come back because they were after him, because he'd gotten mixed up with people who didn't forgive you for leaving. He thought disappearing would protect them. "And in the end, you just disappeared," she said quietly. He looked at the floor, then back at her. "I'd been saving. For life, not for running. I wanted to come back as someone else. With work, with money, with a future. So you wouldn't look at me like a drifter. So Seth." He didn't finish. Marlene looked at him closely. Then she said, "And I would have rather had you just be there. Poor, empty-handed, whatever. But next to me, that damn day, and everyone after." Outside, the rain started. It tapped the roof like it was trying to wash the last of the words away. They both went quiet. What hung between them now wasn't an explanation, it was understanding. Heavy, like a soaked piece of cloth. He stayed, and she allowed it. After that night, the house changed. Not on the outside, same cracks in the frames, same groaning steps. But the air inside grew denser, as if the walls had finally accepted him again. Not as a guest, not as a ghost, but as part of the life that had once been swept out with a broom. Daniel didn't lie still anymore. Slowly, he started moving around, stepping outside, chopping firewood with one hand pressed against his side. He didn't do it for thanks, he did it like penance. Each motion wasn't a gesture of help, but a way of saying, "I know I'm to blame." Seth watched him from a distance, never approached, but never left. Marlene noticed him a few times sitting on the fence, watching Daniel fix the barn door. His face showed no fear, no joy, just interest, quiet, cautious. In the evenings, when the house settled into silence, the three of them sat in the kitchen. Dinner was simple, soup, bread, water. No talking, just the clink of spoons and the crackling of the stove. But even in that silence, something was shifting, like ice underfoot, beginning to give. One night, Marlene woke to a strange warmth in the house. Daniel had added logs to the fire, adjusted the damper, and sat back down by the window. He thought she was asleep, but she saw him holding an old locket in his hands, the one that used to hang from a nail near Eli's bed. He turned it in his fingers, staring into the dark, then set it gently on the shelf beside the other things. He didn't take it, didn't claim it. She closed her eyes. Her heart beat quietly, but heavy. That gesture wasn't a way back into her past. It was respect, maybe even farewell. The next morning, when she went out to fetch water, she found a stack of dry boards near the well. Someone had repaired the pantry floor. No words, no instructions, just done. Marlene didn't say a word, but that evening, when Seth asked why the man had stayed, she answered, Because sometimes a person doesn't leave, even if they already have. The house stayed quiet, but it no longer resisted. For the first time in 6 years, you could breathe inside it again. Autumn kept creeping further into the house. Drafts searched for cracks to slip through. The stove no longer kept up like it used to. Even the lamp gave off a duller glow, as if it were tired of all these nights. That evening, they sat in the kitchen for a long time. Seth had fallen asleep by the stove. Daniel tossed on another log. Marlene was sifting through old papers, bills, notes, not because she needed to, but just to keep her hands busy. She could feel something approaching. He spoke first. "I can't stay here long. I heard someone in town's been asking about me. Not in uniform, but with eyes that look like they already know." She set down the paper without looking up. "You've already been here too long for someone they're hunting." "I know." He walked over to the door, opened it slightly, and looked into the dark. Then said, "I'll leave before morning. I'll leave everything I brought. Let it be of some use. I don't want you paying the price for me." She looked at him for a long time. Her gaze held everything: weariness, fear, anger, and the shadow of something else, like a thought she didn't want to have, was just beginning to surface. "You were out there all this time, alive. And every year I buried you in my head all over again. And now that you've come back, I don't even have the right to say stay." He turned, took a step closer. His voice was lower now. "And if you said it," she shook her head, slowly, "I don't know how to ask." He didn't answer right away. "And I don't know how to stay. But maybe, just this once." He didn't finish. A twig snapped outside the window. Footsteps. One. Then another. Someone was out in the yard. Daniel went to the window. A figure, a man, in a long coat. Not local. He grabbed the rifle, but didn't raise it. Just watched. He knew it had begun. Whoever had been looking for him, they'd found him, or were close. Marlene quickly extinguished the lamp. The stove quieted. In the house, there was only the sound of 3 people breathing. One slept. 2 listened as the night outside tried to break its way in. He didn't leave before morning, and that already meant something. All night, they kept the lights off. The house held its breath. Seth slept soundly, as if he instinctively knew any movement now was a risk. Daniel sat by the wall with the rifle across his lap. Not like a soldier, like a man who knew that every minute could be his last. Marlene brewed coffee in the dark. It was bitter, like everything between them, but warm. They drank in silence. In both their eyes was the weight of sleepless nights, but no fear. They'd been through worse. An hour or 2 before dawn, he said, "I won't let them inside this house. Not for me. For you." She looked at him like she had by the fire. There was no anger left in her eyes. Only recognition he meant what he said. He went out first, through the back door, quiet as a shadow. Marlene circled around the house from the other side. The old barn gave a clear view of the road. She took up position in the loft, like in the old days when wolves had to be scared off. A rider appeared on the road. Then, a second. One wore civilian clothes. The other, a long coat, moving like a man used to giving orders. They dismounted slowly, like they sensed this wasn't just a farm. Someone was waiting. They approached the porch, knocked. No answer. One of them pushed the door open, and the old trap triggered, a wire tied to a kettle. A dull clang. Silence broken. Daniel stepped out from the shadows, slowly, with his hands raised. "There's a woman and a child here. They need nothing from you. I'll come out on my own." The man in the coat raised his hand in response. Gave a signal, alive. Everything was already decided. He knew. She knew. Even Seth understood. But chance always walks behind men. A third rider, young, jittery, emerged from behind the fence. He saw movement and opened fire. One shot, then another. Marlene screamed. Not words, just a sound, sharp and raw. Her eyes widened, like a curtain torn loose by the wind. Daniel fell to his knees. The bullet struck above the heart. Still, he held himself upright, as if commanding his body not to fall. The men shouted, orders, curses. One of them fired into the air. Marlene ran to him, dropped beside him, took his hand. He looked at the sky. His lips moved. "I'm sorry," he said. She leaned in and whispered, "You stayed. That's all I ever needed." He died before sunrise. The men didn't touch the house. They understood it was too late. One removed his hat. Another lowered his eyes. And they left, quietly. Only the wind remained on the porch, as if standing guard over the man who had finally come home. The silence that followed was different. Not empty, like the hush after a shot. Not dead, like a room where the light has gone out. But dense, full, like someone still there holding on. Seth sat on the steps. His boots were dusty. He didn't cry, just stared ahead. Marlene stood at the window, as she had that first night when the northern wind changed. A cloth in her hand. Damp, but not from tears. Daniel was buried beside the garden, where the plum tree used to grow. Marlene dug the grave herself. Seth held the lantern. No priest, no words, just earth, boards, and a sky too wide for the moment. 3 days passed. No one came from town. No one asked questions. Everything faded as quietly as it began. The fire sank into the ground and left a trace. Marlene cleaned the rifle and placed it back in the cabinet. She washed the shirt, folded Daniel's remaining things, and carried them to the barn. She didn't throw them away, just stored them like you store what cannot be returned, but also cannot be forgotten. Seth began to ask questions. Who he was, why he left, why he came back. Marlene answered simply, he was the one who didn't come when we needed him, and then did, when it was already too late. But he came. In spring, she planted new trees by the fence, plum, apple, apricot. In the place where the soil remembered silence. People in town started greeting her again. Someone helped with nails. Someone said the federal men had gone. They weren't looking anymore. It was over. In the evenings, she would sit by the window. No rifle. Just a cup. A quiet face. And if the wind brought the scent of smoke or the creak of leather at the edge of the field, she wouldn't get up. She'd just listen. Some things never return, but they stay with you somehow. Dear friends, if this story moved you, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments what you felt or share your own story. Sometimes, just telling it makes all the difference. We'll see you next time, right here on Wild West Untold, where the forgotten stories still breathe.